Welcome to the webinar Ready for Launch, Space Diplomacy Lab, Media Perspectives on Challenges of the Next Year in Space with three leading space policy journalists, Loren Grush from The Verge, Jeff Foust from SpaceNews, and Ramin Skibba from Wired. My colleague, Dr. Benjamin Schmidt, will share the conversation with the invited speakers, members of the Space Diplomacy Lab, and the audience. This event marks the launch of the Space Diplomacy Lab within the DUCIGS Rethinking Diplomacy program. The core objective of the lab is to provide a forum to convene a diverse multidisciplinary set of academics, students, diplomatic practitioners, and commercial spaceflight leaders from the fields of space science and technology, national security, and international diplomacy to develop cross-cutting research, policy proposals, and solutions to mitigate risks and ensure the promise of a secure and sustainable future of humanity in space. The DUCIGS Rethinking Diplomacy Program is supported by a grant from the Joshua Charles Trent Memorial Foundation Endowment Fund. I'm the director of the Duke Center for International Global Studies. Let me say thank you to our guest speakers, to all the members of the DUCIGS and the different centers that have helped to organize this event, and all to my colleagues from the Space Diplomacy Lab. Even though I know these are tough times, it's nice to think about the future and to think about how to mitigate problems in the future. My colleague, Dr. Benjamin Schmidt, will introduce the speakers and will chair the section.
Thank you, Giovanni, and thank you to our speakers. Before we get into the main program, we did want to make a quick statement given the grave images and news that we are hearing out of Ukraine over the past 48 hours. It's not an exaggeration to say that right now the transatlantic community is facing one of its gravest threats that has found itself in since the end of the Cold War. There can be no doubt that the crisis is one solely of Russia's own making, and as a result, the Kremlin has presented not only a major military security crisis on the Ukrainian border and a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but in the process has challenged norms settled long ago about the post-war security landscape that has upheld transatlantic stability for decades. This includes basic concepts enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act as fundamental as the sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, refraining from the threat or use of force, and the self-determination of a state's international political status. Let's be clear, the future of Ukrainian sovereignty and choice of alliances in foreign policy can only be determined by the people of a free and democratic Ukraine. This is as important as ever to remember as we witness the horrors the Putin regime has unleashed on the independent people of Ukraine over the past 48 hours. The international community needs to continue to levy tough sanctions on the Kremlin and provide military aid to the Ukrainian people as urgently as possible, as the Ukrainian people stand on the front lines of the global struggle between open market liberal democracies that we take for granted and hold dear, and authoritarian dictatorship. Please keep the people of Ukraine not only in your thoughts and prayers, but please take urgent actions as well to donate to charities and speak out supporting Ukraine at this time, which is as vital as ever. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Benjamin Schmidt. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm also a senior fellow for Democratic Resilience at the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington, as well as a Rethinking Diplomacy Fellow and Space Diplomacy Lab co-director here at the Duke Center for Global International Studies. We sit here now at a new era of space activity that is unfolding every day before our eyes. An increasing number of nation states and private sector actors are now capable of deploying a wide array of space technologies to low Earth orbit and beyond. The immense economic, scientific, and societal potential of today's space renaissance has unlocked a fresh set of opportunities for unprecedented innovation and international strategic cooperation beyond Earth's atmosphere. But just like the turbulent nature of international affairs here on Earth, the very human proclivity to take these actions that would endanger the promise of these giant leaps off our planet requires anticipatory diplomacy. Without urgent risk mitigation to address a growing list of space security and regulatory challenges facing the global community, humanity's burgeoning off-planet future could be grounded before it truly blasts off. To help address the emerging challenges, the Duke University Center for International and Global Studies Rethinking Diplomacy program has established the Space Diplomacy Lab, the first meeting of which is taking place right now. The core objective of the Space Diplomacy Lab is to provide a forum to convene a diverse, multidisciplinary set of academics, students, media, diplomatic practitioners, and commercial spaceflight leaders from the fields of space science and technology, national security, and international diplomacy to develop cross-cutting research, policy proposals, and solutions to mitigate risks and ensure the promise of a secure and sustainable future of humanity in space. We will conduct research, publish analysis, and host seminars like this, focused on exploring diplomatic strategies to build out vital regulatory and behavioral norms in low Earth orbit, translunar space, and beyond. Just some of the questions that we're focused on are strengthening international conventions beyond the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, mitigating and reversing space debris, asking questions about how the international community can develop technologies and norms to mitigate and reverse the proliferation of space debris in low Earth orbit and beyond, international commercial regulation, asking questions about what diplomatic pathways can the international community take to develop and enforce rigorous regulatory regimes for the growing set of commercial actors and services operating in low Earth orbit, as well as for planned future lunar and deep space extractive industries. And finally, we bridge priorities across space stakeholders, how to address the challenges of bridging competing priorities between an emerging sector and array of international civil space agencies, military space programs, private sector actors, and the role that scientists and technologists can directly play to support the work of diplomats focused on global space issues. With this in mind, and to address these challenges, I'm so pleased to be joined today by three leading space policy journalists: Loren Grush from The Verge, Jeff Foust from SpaceNews, and Ramin Skibba from Wired, to offer media perspectives on what they view as the greatest geopolitical challenges in space over the next year. So we will begin with that, and once we have basically 5-minute opening statements from each of our great panelists, they will then discuss with us anticipatory space diplomacy strategies with our whole team that contribute to positive socioeconomic and foreign policy tools to keep outer space safe, secure, and sustainable. So about the speakers, we're joined by Loren Grush, who's a science reporter for The Verge, the technology and culture brand from Vox Media, where she specializes in all things space, from distant stars and planets to human spaceflight in the commercial space race. The daughter of two NASA engineers, she grew up surrounded by space shuttles and rocket scientists, quite literally. She is also a host of Spacecraft, an online video series that examines what it takes to send people to space. Before joining The Verge, Loren published stories in Popular Science, The New York Times, Nautilus Magazine, Digital Trends, Fox News, and ABC News. We are then going to hear from Jeff Foust, a senior staff writer for SpaceNews, joining the publication in 2014. He covers civil and commercial space topics, ranging from NASA programs to developments in the entrepreneurial new space field. He has more than a decade of experience writing about space policy, commercial space, and related topics. He earned a PhD in planetary sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1999, a bachelor's degree with honors in geophysics and planetary scientists from Caltech in 1993. And last but not least, Ramin Skibba is an astrophysicist turned science writer and freelance journalist. He covers space travel for Wired magazine. He's written several articles for magazines, newspapers, and online news outlets, including for The Atlantic, Washington Post, National Geographic, Newsweek, Slate, Nature, Wired, Undark, Scientific American, Science, Smithsonian, Aeon, New Scientist, Quanta, 538, The Hill, San Jose Mercury News, and San Francisco Chronicle. He was the president of the San Diego Science Writers Association from 2018 to 2020, and currently serves as its board member. So without further ado, I would like to first ask Loren, then Jeff, then Ramin to give basically 5-minute opening statements, anticipating from your unique perspective as leaders in the space media field, what you think the biggest challenges that we can expect and headlines that we can expect in space are for the next year. Thanks so much.
Great. So I guess I'll get underway here. Obviously, I think a bunch of us agree that the timing of today's talk is very relevant. And I think it just goes to show that when it comes to space, there really is no predictability in the types of topics that we will be covering on a day-to-day basis. And I think that has definitely been indicative of just the last few years of as more and more things happen in the international community, in the commercial world, and at NASA. So I'm sure we will get into the Russian situation at some point, and of course that will be a huge topic moving forward. But in terms of other things that I think have been big topics of discussion in the space world, I'm sure my other panelists will agree. The rise of mega constellations has been a very big topic that I've been following, and I think will continue to be one that we keep an eye on, just because it crosses so many different areas in the news realm. It's an internet story, it's a space traffic management story, it's, a commercial story, and it's a space debris story. And so I think what's really interesting about the move for more mega constellations in low Earth orbit is that, if you want to make one change to these systems, it creates this kind of, side effect where all these other companies and NASA and agencies have questions and concerns about what those changes will mean. And we don't really have an answer for that yet, just because we continue to keep putting satellites into orbit without a real understanding of what the carrying capacity of low Earth orbit is and what the side effects of having all of these satellites in low Earth orbit will mean for our future, and if they can be sustained, especially when we don't have an agreement on the positioning of all these satellites in low Earth orbit. Another thing I've been eagerly following, of course, is NASA's push into lunar space and cislunar space and all of the commercial activities surrounding that. So their Artemis mission and the Artemis Accords that have been generated for that mission. Obviously, the Artemis Accords set standards for how we will explore the moon in the future. And I think as that is also ties into current Russian cooperation, because Russia isn't quite happy with those standards, and nor do they really want to be involved in the Artemis mission. And then another thing that I'm also very interested in is the commercialization of low Earth orbit. So as we discuss the future of the International Space Station and, it's an inevitable end, NASA is looking toward what will be next. And they're working towards steps to, incentivize the commercial industry to take over the domain of low Earth orbit. And I think those discussions are definitely going to become much more prominent as the concern over the future of the International Space Station is kind of put into the spotlight right now. So there's plenty of other things that I could discuss, but I'll leave it to Jeff and Ramin to take over from here.
Great. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for taking some time out on a Friday to join us. Loren talked about a lot of these key issues, which I agree with are important. Just to touch on or elaborate on a few of those. First of all, obviously, I'm sure we're going to talk more about the effects of Russia's invasion on Ukraine on international space cooperation and space policy. I'll start off with maybe a slightly contrarian take that I think that the 2014 annexation of Crimea and incursion in the eastern Ukraine and the responses that followed will probably have had a bigger effect on space policy than what's happening now with the current invasion of Ukraine, simply because what we've seen, particularly over the intervening 8 years, is a greater separation of Russia and the West in space. Yes, they do cooperate on the International Space Station. That appears likely to continue. But what we're seeing is that Russia has no interest in participating in the Artemis program. It was sort of penciled in for a time to provide a module for the Lunar Gateway, and it's not planning to proceed with that at this time. And instead, Russia appears to be moving closer to China. And there are talks about an international lunar research station that would combine those two countries' exploration ambitions and perhaps other countries as well, separate from the Artemis program, which has included the other ISS partners, as well as some new players who have signed on to the Artemis Accord, including Ukraine as one of those countries. So we may be seeing the beginning of the end of Russia-Western cooperation in space now that may not survive after the end of the space station. In terms of some other issues, space sustainability, which Loren touched upon, that seems to be a broad catch-all for all these topics, whether it's orbital debris or the rise of mega constellations, the effects that those mega constellations have on ground-based astronomy. Be it optical or radio astronomy, has been an emerging issue. And it's brought up a lot of regulatory and policy issues at both the national and increasingly the international level, including at the UN's Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So I expect to see more of that discussion in the future in some broad terms about how do you manage space traffic, or how do you coordinate space traffic, and how do you deal with some of the tricky policy issues when it comes to trying to clean up orbital debris. The Outer Space Treaty, as strictly read, can make it difficult for countries to actually remove objects unless you have permission of the owner of that object, and that assumes who the owner of that object is if it's a piece of debris. So that brings up some complications as well. I think there are some other issues that we'll see again in terms of commercialization of whether it's low Earth orbit or increasing commercial activities at the moon, and some of the challenges in terms of coordinating an increasing number of both companies and countries that are interested in operating in space. And I think one other point to bring about, we're talking a lot about the what's, in terms of issues of space policy, but there's also the question of how. The foundation of international space law is the Outer Space Treaty, and it's more than 50 years old. There have been some discussions in the last several years about whether the Outer Space Treaty needs to be updated or even replaced. I think those have pretty much have fallen by the wayside in terms of very serious pursuit about doing so. But it has illustrated that it's very difficult to come up with any sort of binding international treaty when it comes to anything related to space internationally. Even developing some of the non-binding guidelines at the UN for long-term sustainability of space was a process that took a decade. And these were for fairly common sense guidelines to avoid creating more space debris. At the same time, though, you see commercial efforts in particular moving at much faster speeds. And I think mega constellations are an example of that are really outpacing the ability of space law in many respects to keep up. And that brings up a question, well, how do you deal with some of these emerging issues like space debris or space sustainability in general, mega constellations, some of these new efforts, if sort of the traditional mechanisms like treaties are just far too slow to keep up? Do you need bilateral agreements, multilateral agreements? Just do we hope that non-binding guidelines are sufficient to keep things stable in low Earth orbit? I think that's going to be a key issue that's going to be more and more discussed in the years to come, simply because of the rise of more countries and more companies operating in space that are sort of outpacing some of traditional space policy guidelines to keep up with. And I think I'll leave it there and hand it over.
Thank you for inviting me for this event. I'm glad to see attention to space diplomacy. I would say there's not enough media coverage, in my opinion, although the three of us have certainly drawn attention to these issues. And I'm glad to see more research on space diplomacy as well. Just to start off with a general comment, I like to say that, or I like to think about when I'm writing about something that involves diplomacy, that involves international relations, I try to bring in a historical context, a political context, what brought us here. And so, when we complain, when we're criticizing rightly the reckless anti-satellite test by Russia not that long ago, I also raised the point that the U.S., China, and India have also conducted similar tests, and so there's definitely a lot of responsibility to go around when it comes to generating space debris. And then there's criticism of China's hypersonic missiles. But U.S. and Russia are also developing the same technologies. So there's definitely basically a rivalry between those three countries, and then a number of other space powers as well. And then I would say, building on what Jeff was saying about the Outer Space Treaty, I was one of the people who've written about how wrote a provocative piece or ambitious piece about how there should be a post Outer Space Treaty, but I absolutely agree that is not likely happening. There's no appetite for that, and there's been a push for non-binding norms. That's what they're calling them. So sort of basically rules that would be followed in space, but they're rules about behavior. So it sounds like it would be unlikely that there would be a ban or moratorium on anti-satellite tests or maybe on deploying weapons in space. Right now, the only weapons that are basically prohibited in space are nukes from the Outer Space Treaty itself. And then there's also another issue, which it's kind of interesting. It comes up in TV and movies, like on the Space Force sometimes, is that in space, there are a lot of things that are dual use. There are, if you have a spacecraft that can maneuver out of the way of hitting something else, avoiding a space collision, it could just as easily move into the way of something else and be used as a weapon. And as some spacecraft develop more abilities, they can also be used as weapons. And there's anything that can be used to different kinds of lasers and different kinds of other kinds of technologies can be used in different ways. And some military technologies that are paired with others on the same spacecraft. There's so in addition to norms, I would say. We talked a little bit about the Artemis Accords. That's not quite an international agreement, and it came out of the Trump administration. While there's been a number of countries that have come on board with it, it's unclear to me yet how much legitimacy it has internationally. The same goes with so there's the Space Act of 2015 under the Obama administration, which it was basically offering a particular interpretation of the Outer Space Treaty, allowing companies to take space resources without, claiming territory. There was some complaining about it, but it seems to be some people are agreeing with that interpretation. But I think that's something that will be continued to be debated. And I think there's a number of other things we could talk about, but I think I'll just leave it at that for now, and we'll get into the questions and we'll discuss more of these issues.
Great. Well, thanks. Yeah, excellent opening comments and a lot to talk about. We could be on this call for weeks, I think, and never cover everything that we've set out here. But I'll try to just start by reacting to some of the comments we saw yesterday. I know each of you on social media has commented and written about this. Yesterday, as a part of the second round of sanctions in response for Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, President Biden included sanctions that would, quote, degrade the Russian space program, which he stated at the White House yesterday. In response, Dmitry Prigozhin, Roscosmos, Russia's civil space agency, Roscosmos, chief made pretty incendiary comments in return, and that included statements about who will ensure that the International Space Station doesn't crash into the United States at the end of its life, given the orbital inclination going over the United States and not over the Russian Federation, and blaming U.S. private sector for creating space debris. I think that is probably read as a swipe at Elon Musk's mega constellations, which we can certainly talk about. Of course, he left out the point of Russia's direct ascent anti-satellite weapons tests, creating space debris during Russia's military buildup before its invasion of Ukraine in just a few months ago. And so with that in mind, I really want to ask a quick reaction from each of you on the comments, the impacts, and if you can, the difference between the sanctions that we saw on the Russian space sector in 2014 versus today, and how are these export controls on critical space technologies going to change the dynamic between the U.S. and Russia in terms of space cooperation, and also Russia's capability to conduct space operations? Will this really, quote, degrade the Russian space program to the extent President Biden laid out? we can go back in the same order. So Loren, you, then Jeff, then Ramin.
Sure. So I think the first things first is there was probably a lot of panic in regard to what Rogozin was saying yesterday. And it was open to some misinterpretation just because he tweeted in Russian, and a lot of people were trying to kind of understand the meaning behind his words. The way I read it, and you guys can chime in if you like, he was essentially saying that without Russia, the capability to provide propulsion to the International Space Station would go away. I don't think he was actually threatening to deorbit the space station over the U.S. There was legitimate concern about that, so I just want to put that out there. And we just wrote a story about this. I will be publishing it once we're done with the webinar here. But yes, essentially, the ISS does rely on Russia technology in order to boost its orbit, move out of the way of debris, also helps with attitude control on the space station as well. But it's also a symbiotic relationship. NASA is also very instrumental in when it comes to generating electricity and other aspects of space stations. So I think what Rogozin does a lot of the times is bluster, but these comments have an added weight right now because of the situation that's going on. And I think there is a lot of concern because Biden himself said there was a complete rupture in US-Russia relations. So I'm sorry, I forget the actual question, but that was I provided an interpretation of.
No, that's exactly that's exactly right. That's the sort of comment we're looking for. Thank you.
Right, exactly. So I think context is important. Rogozin is very boisterous online, and we need to take that into account. But like I said, and I'm interested to hear Jeff's response because he thinks that the Crimea situation was much more indicative of where things are how space policy has been shaped. But I think right now there just is an added weight to what is being said because things are much more strained than ever in the recent era.
Yeah, let me sort of, go back to that point there. Loren's, I think, quite correct in terms of trying to interpret what Rogozin says or what Rogozin tweets on those issues. I don't think he was trying to talk about deliberately deorbiting the space station. At least I hope not. When we go back to 2014, when the U.S. and the West levied sanctions on Russia, and Rogozin, who at the time was deputy prime minister, started talking about denying NASA access to the Soyuz seats that it needed to get astronauts to the space station, because at the time, Soyuz was the only vehicle available to get to the space station. He also talked about stopping exports of the RD-180 engine that powers the Atlas V, which is one of the major launch vehicles used for, in particularly, national security missions. He never followed through on either threat. The RD-180 engines kept coming, and the Soyuz seats, kept being available to NASA. But the threats in both cases really affected space policy in the U.S. because it really, for NASA, was still trying to win over some skeptics in Congress about the Commercial Crew Program, whether companies could really do that. And I think the threat of losing access to Soyuz seats wiped away the last of the skepticism on Capitol Hill about the Commercial Crew Program, because what you saw was that NASA kept getting what it was asking for funding for Commercial Crew in subsequent years, whereas early on in the program, NASA struggled to get even a fraction of the funding it asked for Commercial Crew, which led to delays in the program, and as a result, greater dependence on Soyuz, as it turns out. So, Rogozin can't make that threat again because we have Crew Dragon, and hopefully in the near future, we will have Starliner providing access to the space station. As for the RD-180, that threat to withdraw access to that engine came around the same time as Elon Musk was lobbying the Air Force. In fact, ended up filing suit against the Air Force to open up national security launches to competition, that it shouldn't be just ULA getting access to those launches, but that SpaceX should have an opportunity to compete. And that led that combination of the threat of losing the RD-180 and SpaceX demanding a chance for competition led to changes in the program. Now SpaceX is a major provider of launch services for the US military. ULA is obviously still doing that, but that led them to develop the new Vulcan rocket, whose first launch is going to be coming up later this year with a domestically produced engine. ULA has all the RD-180s that it needs for its remaining Atlas launches. So even if Rogozin threatened to cut off access to the RD-180, that would not affect national security launch. So in that respect, what happened in 2014 and the policy reverberations from that had a much greater impact than anything that might happen now, because I don't think anyone is seriously talking about ending the International Space Station program again because of that codependence, and that there's not a lot of future prospects for cooperation with Russia. They're not going to be part of the Artemis program. Russia is not a major player in the commercial launch industry anymore. So there's less interaction, and that interaction is and potential dependence is fading. So in that respect, that's why I get back to saying that 2014 may be more influential than 2022 when it comes to space policy.
I don't have a whole lot much more to add beyond what Loren and Jeff said. It definitely seems like U.S.-Russian relations have been collapsing for a number of years. I would add it's interesting to look at what's coming ahead with the commercial space stations. I mean, as far as we know, the space station, the International Space Station, will be around till 2030. But then we have the Axiom modules will become their own small station, and then we have 3 candidates for a commercial space station that NASA is investing in, and probably around that time, at least one of those will be in place. And it's not clear to me yet, anyway, what role Russia will play in this, and whether they'll be a customer or not. And so we could see, I don't know, we might see a shift where Russia starts using the Chinese space station. I'm not sure how that will play out.
I guess I'll also add to, it will be in the immediate after effects of all this. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out with the extension of the International Space Station. And because I know that the Biden administration wants to continue that. They've already signed off on that, but we still need Russian agreement to do that. And then I am still very interested about this upcoming crew swap. I know that they are still working toward it, and that they have a cosmonaut picked out for the SpaceX Crew Dragon for this fall. I'm not sure that's exactly a done deal, but I guess we'll see how that plays out in the coming months, depending on how dire the situation gets here.
I'll just ask a very quick follow-up to that. Do you anticipate that that the International Space Station could continue without Russian support if they, say, terminated their contracts or agreements in 2024, and we and the international community decided to continue?
I don't want to say never. I hate to say never in any of these scenarios, but an expert I talked to yesterday had a really great quote that was essentially like, we have to work together or it's not going to work. So I just don't see that happening without Russian involvement. However, this is NASA and they figure things out. So I don't want to say that that is impossible. But the way that things are set up, it's much safer and less complicated for Russia to stay in the mix and kind of enjoy this weird immunity bubble that we have when things get really strained on the ground.
Yeah, I would agree and point out just one other thing, that if Russia decided to terminate its participation in the ISS in 2024, there really wouldn't be much for its human spaceflight program to do, because while it's talked about developing its own space station, that is still years away, and it's invested actually in new modules that it finally launched to the space station last year after years of development. So it seems, if they walked away from it, they wouldn't be able to do much other than fly some Soyuz around in orbit for a few days at a time. And I don't think that's particularly palatable to them.
Okay, well, I want to follow up on that with one more question on the Artemis Accords before bringing in Ambassador Pearson and Professor Lundgren. How much do you think in the short term, medium term, long term, pick which one you want to talk about, that the announced Russia-China parallel partnership or competing partnership to the Artemis Accords real versus diplomatic posturing. And the reason I asked that, I've seen reports about the Russian space agency asking for the Tianhe orbital module of the Chinese space station to be launched in an orbital inclination that would allow for easier access from Russian cosmodromes. But ultimately, the Chinese decided not to make it more beneficial to orbital insertion from Chinese territory. So with that in mind, how do we assess this? This obviously has major diplomatic implications for broader Russia-China relations. And so I just want to throw that to all three of you. Maybe go in reverse order, Ramin first, then Jeff, then Loren.
I'm not sure. I would say that I think we could see in an emerging situation where Russia and China are moving with their rules, and the U.S. and its allies move with its rules. But neither the Russian and Chinese program, their guidelines, nor the Artemis Accord guidelines are on the scale of really have to carry the weight of international law. Like I think, for example, the non-binding norms that are very slowly playing out in the United Nations will carry more weight, but they're also don't have the same scope as the Artemis Accords. So I think it's the whole situation is still coming together.
Yeah, I think that, what Russia and China have talked about for this International Lunar Research Station is more of an agreement to agree to cooperate rather than a formal, firm program. They talk a lot about setting up a research station at the South Pole of the Moon sometime in the 2030s, but there has not been a lot of details since they announced it last year exactly what that would entail. And I would argue Russia probably needs to work with China more than China needs to work with Russia. China's got a pretty ambitious lunar exploration program of its own with robotic missions and, no doubt in the longer term human missions. Russia's program is further behind and in terms of development and, could use the Chinese resources more than China can use Russian expertise in that respect. So, I think we still need to see a lot more details about that. And there's also the question of who is going to cooperate with China and Russia. They've talked about sending out letters of invitation to various nations. It's not clear how many are going to respond. I know in one case, they sent out such an invitation to the European Space Agency. And I've asked ESA leadership in the past about it. And they said, well, it's something we want to talk about with our member states. At the same time, ESA is a major partner in the Artemis program. So I think they've made pretty clear where their priorities are in terms of cooperation in lunar exploration. But certainly what China and Russia are doing bears watching, but we don't have a lot of details about how that is going to play out and who is going to cooperate with them.
Yeah, I think Jeff summed it up great. And I'll just add, there is such a big question mark right now as to Russia's status on the world stage. He brought up Europe, and now I'm thinking about the ExoMars mission that Russia and Europe are collaborating on, and how that will impact the launch of that rover coming up. But yeah, I think with Russia, it's just there's usually a lot of talk first, and then we see action later. And it's hard to gauge, like we said with Rogozin, when that talk is actually serious and when it's not. And I think right now they're mostly just keeping their options open. And I think they'll probably be amenable to change depending on how things play out in the coming months and years.
Great, thank you. I'll first turn to my colleague, Professor Britt Lundgren. We're both astronomers, and we both have seen impact, as has been said on this panel, from mega constellations potentially interfering with observations from the ground. I develop instrumentation and technologies for a set of millimeter wavelength telescopes at the South Pole at the moment. I know Britt is focused on optical astronomy and other areas that could be impacted. So Professor Lundgren, if you could speak to that. And then I think also we'd like to hear about the space debris issue, associated with that proliferation of mega constellations.
Sure. Thanks, Ben. I've really enjoyed the comments from all the panelists today. So thank you all for your insight and sharing your expertise. I'm also going to be interested to hear what Ambassador Pearson has to say. A question that I'll save for a little bit is about how significant a diplomatic lever the ISS really is in terms of Russia and US diplomatic relations. And so I hope he'll have a chance to give us a little bit of his insight on that. In terms of the mega constellations, I think Loren's done a really great job of, explaining that problem. And I think if we'd had this panel a couple of months ago, maybe that would have been the biggest issue going on in space right now. Or maybe I'm a little biased as a ground-based astronomer, but I would also have thought a couple of months ago, maybe one of the big space stories of the year would be the successes of the James Webb Space Telescope and what we'll learn through its deeper infrared look at the universe and nearby, planets and things like that. So the geopolitics kind of taking center stage of SpaceNews is not something I had really anticipated, but maybe that's my own tunnel vision on these things. But just to go back to the mega constellations, I think this continues to be a problem. And of course, if you're going to increase the military or militarization of low Earth orbit, then the space debris problem could only be exponentially worse. We've talked in previous meetings of this diplomacy lab with experts talking about how it's not only the dangerous projectiles created by that space junk that we need to increasingly worry about, but also the light pollution that accumulates from those thousands or tens of thousands of small reflective pieces in low Earth orbit. And some astronomers have done and published recent studies showing that, some of the darkest places on the Earth, which had been most advantageous for the kind of scientific exploration of the sky that my colleagues enjoy being able to do, are even now being affected due to that kind of global light pollution produced by all of those particulates of various sizes. So this is something that astronomers have been becoming increasingly active about, the loss of the night sky as something we can study from the ground. But also, I think there's a lot of talk about decolonizing space, which had really been gaining momentum in some circles of astronomy, especially with the debate over the 30-meter telescope being built on Mauna Kea in Hawaii, and the mega constellations play into this as well. So I know Ramin's done some great reporting on this recently, and I think just my perspective would be that the work that I think was being done in a positive way towards making space more inclusive and accessible, not just for the major space powers and the space capitalists, but for globally educational and scientific purposes, I feel like we may be losing a little bit of ground, and maybe rapidly based on current events. So I don't know, that's just my 2 cents. I'll leave it there. I don't have specific questions, but I would like to know what Ambassador Pearson thinks about the ISS, and I'll maybe just leave it to him next.
Let's go to the panel first, then bring in Ambassador.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
So you raised a bunch of interesting questions there. I think with the mega constellations, I think we've talked more about space debris, but it's almost been, things have moved very fast. It's almost been like a launch first, ask questions later kind of situation where, honestly, I think space debris is not the biggest concern right now, because a lot of these satellites, they can deorbit once they're at their end of life. But definitely the light pollution is a big concern. At some point, we could have more, lit satellites than stars that you can see in the night sky. And what astronomers, I think, are concerned about the most is naturally, because it involves our very existence, is the sighting or viewing near-Earth asteroids. And so the smaller near-Earth asteroids, like the one that the DART spacecraft will crash into, only something around half of them have been spotted. And the best time to find them is at twilight, but that's also when there's a more of a density of those satellites in view. And so that's a problem. If we have less time, you know, Leonardo DiCaprio or whoever won't be able to save the day. And so, and then in addition, there's the decolonization is definitely something I've been following, and I wrote an essay about that last year. I think between the mega constellations and the 30-meter telescope, I think there's definitely been more attention to, you know, who has access to space, who makes these decisions, and who doesn't. And so there's been a growing, I would say, a growing call, at least among astronomers and some space scientists and others, as well as indigenous researchers, to draw attention to these issues. But I'm not sure how much. I think it's a long-term campaign, really. I'm not sure how much what will happen in the near future or not. Whether the 30-meter telescope will be moved, for example, from its Mauna Kea current site. But I mean, there's now the International Astronomical Union has started its Dark and Quiet Skies Center, and that's something that means that now there's more attention to the light pollution and to radio signals that satellites send, because that's something that astronomers need. And so I feel like gradually there may be more attention to these issues over time.
Yeah, you know, I just want, you know, they're all good points. I want to point out, this gets back to the issue of, you know, how do you address these issues? What's the proper forum for addressing these issues? If you waited for some sort of international treaty governing, say, brightness of satellites and, you know, and you know, radio frequency interference issues, it'd be too late. There'd be tens of thousands of satellites launched, you know, by that point, before you got that. I mean, literally, there's a SpaceX Starlink launch going on right now as we speak. So what you've seen is, you know, you need alternative mechanisms for coordinating these issues, and what the IAU is doing, what is happening even before that between the astronomical community and companies like SpaceX, to work on efforts to at least mitigate the worst effects of these constellations, to set guidelines in terms of, you know, what altitude should the satellites be at, what sort of brightness should they be. And, you know, what we found is that the companies are willing to take some steps to, again, mitigate the worst of the issues. The question is, are those steps alone going to be sufficient? And certainly they are not binding in any legal sense, but they provide a faster avenue of addressing at least the worst of the issues, because it's going to take much longer for international law or even national law to catch up to some of these topics.
Yeah, that's all great. I think what I would just add is, I think the whole mega constellation situation, and notably Starlink, really highlights the ongoing friction right now between this nimble, rapid moving commercial environment and a regulatory environment that wasn't quite prepared for such things to move at this fast pace. And I mean, we are seeing all of these effects in real time, and we're all kind of trying to keep up. I mean, I know that a lot of people and astronomers had concerns about the Starlink constellation before it was launched, but it really went into overdrive when astronomers saw those first string of satellites and just how bright they were in the sky. And so I think what it shows is that, you know, and there are other areas that illustrate this too, especially with, you know, the launches of SpaceX's Starship rocket, and how the FAA is trying to keep up with those and make the decisions for whether or not, you know, the environment surrounding Boca Chica are ready to support those launches. Right now, we are in a position that we weren't in, you know, a couple decades ago, where the space industry is moving at such a fast pace, and we don't have the regulatory environment equipped to handle the speed at which mostly SpaceX, but also other companies want to get things done. And so I think that kind of friction is going to continue into the future, and we need to really kind of have a better idea and a better framework in place that can keep up with the speed at which these companies are moving.
Great, thank you so much. I will now turn to Ambassador Bob Pearson. We have heard, I think, a very encapsulated call from Loren just now on the need for regulation and norms. This is something we've been talking about in this program for some time now. And who better to talk about it from a diplomatic perspective and how we can actually get some of those norms rolled out than Ambassador Bob Pearson. Bob, we'll turn to you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Jeff and Loren and Ramin, for your comments. I mean, we have a treasure trove of possible issues to attack, which really reflect the complexity of everything in space now. And we all know that what happens in space actually happens on Earth. So we are faced with lots of consequences. Just to answer Britt's question very quickly, I ran an NGO in Washington called IREX, which during the Cold War, the worst of the Cold War, managed an exchange program of academics, high-level academics between the United States and the then Soviet Union. So there's an incentive for Russia to keep one chair at another desk, and that could be the space station. And they'd be worse off, in my opinion, I agree with Jeff, if they left than if they stay. And so I think that there is a reason for them to stay and grumble and complain, but still not to put all their cards in the China deck. The main point of what I'd like to mention to you is to move from the acute phase, which we've been discussing about what happens in Ukraine and happening in space, and to what I'm going to call the chronic problem, and to present a new model that you might think about. Instead of the great power rivalry model, which is what's going to be in the news and be very appealing to people, think about the leadership that the Americans showed at the recent climate control summit. And think about President Biden's attempt to call the world's democracies together to focus on human values that we all cherish. And the U.S. still has the power of convening that neither Russia nor China have, nor do nations trust them to have. So with that power in hand, we can put together a coalition of nations, many of whom depend on us either for values or for economic assistance or for security, to try to deal with some of these problems. So I call it as a coalition model, but the idea is to use that as a discussion group as globally as possible among like-minded countries to set standards for behavior. Setting standards for behavior is not enforceable, of course, as you've pointed out, but setting standards for behavior is a model. And the more you shame someone who's not involved in those standards of behavior, the more pressure there is on them to make concessions. Look at the fact that China showed up at the, at least in text, at the climate change summit in order to show that they were somehow associated with the broader goals when they had basically turned their backs on it until the United States showed up and took an initiative. So I'd like to take the chronic problem, the long-term issues, for example, space debris. We can't have a treaty, but we can develop norms of behavior. We can show that every country that launches retrieves that launch vehicle, it either returns to the atmosphere or some other, or it's brought back to the Earth in some other way. We can show that we're working, I know the ESA is working a lot on debris retrieval mechanisms, and there too is an idea that we could use to incentivize the retrieval of debris. We could create a norm of behavior in which it's true, the launching nation owns the space vehicle, but we could have a norm of behavior that you don't launch an attack on your own dead vehicle. So to create space debris. So those are the kinds of things that a coalition could work on that would demonstrate the exceptionalism of the Chinese and the Russians in some of the behavior that they are carrying out. And then I'll close just by referring to dual-use technologies need a lot of work on how to establish verification, detente, sharing of information, those things that have worked in other areas which could work here, but have to work at first on a voluntary basis. So I wouldn't try to worry, frankly, about treaties at this point. I would worry about behaviors, and I would take advantage of the power of the Americans to convene an international coalition to focus on those kinds of problems.
I'd just like to comment on the climate change analogy, because I've had a number of sources compare space debris to climate change, since it's you could say, a gradually worsening situation. First, I would like to say that I'm not sure how much authority the U.S. government has on climate change. I mean, like we have, I mean, honestly, or worldwide, we've been very slow to respond, and the Biden administration hasn't done a whole lot on climate change. Like if climate change is a good analogy for space debris, then it's going to worsen for a while before it gets better. So the situation is that we have lots and lots of dead spacecraft, and then as you go down to smaller sizes, there's more and more of those pieces, and then down to around 10 centimeters is the smallest that can currently be tracked. And eventually maybe slightly smaller objects can be tracked. But even something as small as a bolt, if it, flying at such a fast speed, if it hits a spacecraft in just the wrong way, it can render the spacecraft, it won't blow up the spacecraft, but the satellite could be dead and then becomes its own piece of debris. And so it's definitely a worsening problem where at least some parts of low Earth orbit, say in the next couple decades, could become very difficult to deploy spacecraft. And I think it's a gradually worsening situation, and I've also compared it to the to plastics in the ocean, where it's important to try to clean up the mess, but at this point, it's hard to see how much a significant fraction can be cleaned up, and so maybe the best focus is to make sure that no new trash gets put in there. And so I like all the efforts to label spacecraft, to make sure that they can deorbit or move up to a graveyard orbit. And there are a lot of technologies that are being developed to, remove debris and escort things down to lower Earth orbit where they can decay, have a decaying orbit. But it's going to take a while before those technologies get, off the drawing board and into orbit. And then I think it was Jeff who raised the issue of like, if you don't know who, where this object came from, who decides, you have to get somebody's permission before you can actually touch the thing, let alone deorbit it. And so it's a complicated situation as far as removing debris.
I'll add to what you were saying earlier, Ambassador, but I think maybe what you're talking about with this coalition, a good model for that could possibly be the Artemis Accords. The issue with the Artemis Accords, though, is that we're not at the moon yet, and it's still going to remain to be seen, whether or not people adhere to these standards, what kind of mechanisms do we use when they, breach these standards. So I think that model could possibly be used in order to create standards in terms of debris mitigation, space traffic management, and especially if we are all saying, as I think we're saying, that a treaty is just too slow to actually address these fast moving changes and side effects that we're seeing. So I think, maybe the Artemis Accords, I think the Artemis Accords are a very unique initiative and solution to the problem of slow moving international legislation. So yes, perhaps it is a new model that we can all use in order to be more nimble in space, since clearly people are moving at a much faster pace than ever before.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of sort of crafting these norms of behavior through some mechanism, I think, is something that makes a lot of sense. And obviously it would be much easier to do than any sort of binding treaty. The question is going to be, how does it get organized? Who leads this? Is this is it a few countries that come together and start bringing together others? Or is it something that's sort of a more organic bottoms up sort of initiative that percolates up? I was at a conference last week where Kevin O'Connell, who is the former director of the Office of Space Commerce in the Commerce Department, which has responsibility to take over civil space traffic management in the U.S., was talking about this, and he was really drawing a model of developing these sort of rules of road from companies and organizations operating spacecraft, and sort of building those up and then codifying those over time. And today you see agreements among satellite operators. You see agreements between satellite operators and government organizations about how do you handle close approaches of satellites, who's going to maneuver when, issues like that. So that's already starting to happen. The question is, can you bring that together in some sort of consistent way to make something that is perhaps more overarching over some period of time, some reasonable period of time, versus rather relying on some sort of international organization to step in. The UN has this new open-ended working group on rules of the road and best practices for space. It's actually supposed to last just a couple of years rather than being open-ended. It's sort of a starting point, but you can imagine that individual organizations and companies could potentially move a lot faster than a UN organization.
Yeah, could I just, thank you very much. Could I just give a short response? I'm sorry, Loren, you had something else you wanted to say?
I was just going to add, I think that's what's so unique about space compared to any other industry on the planet. I mean, imagine if you were on a road and you were just trusting, well, we could get into this, but imagine if you were just trusting that the car was going to maneuver out of the way, autonomously, and there were no regulations for that, but that's essentially what's happening when it comes to the SpaceX Starlink satellites. They decided that they were going to put in this technology that, maneuvers out of the way, but there was so much confusion about that at first because no one knew where the Starlink satellites were going to maneuver to. And now we've learned that the Starlink satellites they're just going to maneuver on their own. They consider them to be the ones to maneuver, not the other satellite. And I just think that's what's so interesting about space is that the companies and the people that are in space right now are the ones leading the way in terms of crafting these new norms of behavior, like Jeff said. And whereas it's, the government is kind of trying to keep up, but, and I think that's just it's a very unique situation compared to other industries out there.
Okay, thanks. I'd just like to say a couple of short things. One is that if you don't have a problem, you don't need diplomacy. If you have a problem, you need diplomacy. And if you allow conflict to persist, if you allow competition to persist, it often leads to conflict. So there is a human incentive to avoid conflict. And I think that without trying to pose my suggestion as a solution to everything, that it is a suggestion. I personally would energize the National Space Council to actually do something instead of using the hortatory language that always issues from the organizational expansion they go through. And that could act as a leadership center for dealing with these kinds of issues. And I know that when you discover a problem that needs diplomatic solutions, Ramin, the problem always gets worse before you begin to work on the solution. So the fact that climate change will get worse, that ocean debris will get worse, that's a definition of the problem, not a reason to say we need to step aside. So, but I think your ideas are terrific. And I just wanted to offer this one other option, which is American leadership, a coalition, whatever it takes, not the UN, but state to state diplomacy in an international setting that might help us get to closer solutions to these problems. So thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you, Ambassador Bob Pearson. Ambassador Pearson is Duke Rethinking Diplomacy Program, also former U.S. Ambassador to Turkey and Director General of the Foreign Service. And we also heard from Professor Britt Lundgren of the University of North Carolina at Asheville for Physics and Astronomy. And so with that, I do want to take a couple of quick questions from the audience. We've gotten some great questions in the Q&A feature. This one comes from Jonathan Wiener. A question on space and the current conflict in Ukraine. What if a US military or intelligence satellite were blinded in the next few days, possibly intentionally by Russia, as it demonstrated in November, or possibly by space debris? What would the range of responses or countermeasures be that the US could take or should take?
Well, I'll start and say one of the big challenges is going to be attribution. If something happens to a US satellite, how do you know it was the Russians who did it? And that's actually an issue that General Dickinson, the head of US Space Command, raised earlier this week, is that, if it's something like a ASAT missile like what Russia tested in November, that's pretty clear. But if it's something that temporarily blinds a satellite or interferes with communications or something like that, it becomes much more harder to attribute that to Russia, and therefore makes it more difficult to be able to come up with a response. Space Command would be responsible with coming up with the options for a response if a US satellite was disabled or destroyed in some way by that. I think one of the issues that they want to do is that they do not want to make a bad problem worse. They don't want to do something like create more debris if there is an ASAT test, because that would, affect all parties, including the US, and its ability to operate in low Earth orbit. So I think the first challenge would be, first and foremost, determining that, in fact, Russia was at cause for doing something like that, and then trying to come up with a proportional solution that doesn't make the problem, even worse.
Yeah, I'll say, it's such a unique situation. And I don't know if we've ever addressed something like that before. Maybe Jeff can correct me. But, adding on to the attribution thing, the problem we have with space and what goes on in space is we have to act like detectives every time something happens from another country. And we have to go off of clues that we have from various different means. For instance, was there a NOTAM in place when a rocket was launched? That's a clue. So yeah, we are kind of, I don't want to say we're flying blind in space a lot of times, but there are a lot of disagreements on where things are in space, what has actually happened in space. So it might not even be clear, if a satellite was blinded because of, a missile or because of a space debris hit. Those are things that take time to figure out. And I don't think we're very equipped at the moment to have swift action or retaliation against some kind of space hostility.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the attribution situation is really difficult at this point. I mean, you can also have a situation where a military satellite or a key satellite ends up being disabled, and it at first seems that there are possibly Russian hackers involved. You could have I would imagine that people at Space Force and Space Command would not want to respond too quickly and want to figure out what's going on first before responding. You could end up with, it may turn out that it might not have been hackers. It might have been a system that failed and or some other reason. And so, before responding to something that is not clear, like a missile test, people want to figure out exactly what happened.
I'll just add briefly, one other thing is that the response might be different if the attack is on a commercial satellite versus a US government satellite. We've certainly seen a lot of satellite imagery from companies like Planet and Maxar and Capella. Those are certainly being used not just commercially, but also by the national security space community. If those satellites are, disrupted in some way, would the response be different than if it was, say, a reconnaissance satellite operated by the NRO? That's an open question. I don't think that there, again, are good answers for.
Great. I'll take one more question from the audience, then we'll get your final thoughts. This last question from the audience is from Marco Tantardini. While currently planned programs such as ESA's ExoMars may not be affected, do you believe that Russia and ESA won't plan to collaborate on new missions for at least a decade, given the circumstances?
I don't know. I don't want to say for the next decade. That's much too far out to speculate, but I think definitely for the time being, especially with ESA and with NASA, I think we will not be seeing any new announcements of collaborations. Obviously, things are delayed, or any kind of pleasantries are going to be delayed. I know that there was talk of Administrator Bill Nelson going to Russia. Those plans are definitely on pause, if not canceled. So I think a decade is much too far out to speculate. I do think the future of the ExoMars rover will be interesting to follow in the next few months, especially since it doesn't have to launch this year, but the opening to launch to Mars is this summer or later this summer, and that happens every 2 years. So yes, it's definitely going to be, for now, a fraught time in terms of new relationships and new partnerships, but things can definitely change. And just to add, there is benefit to international cooperation, even with Russia. This space exploration is a powerful tool when it comes to keeping countries together and on the same page about something. I don't believe the International Space Station is going to solve the Ukrainian conflict that's going on right now, but it is an important thing to note that we are still tethered to Russia through this enormous program. And it is a multi-billion-dollar program that we've invested in for nearly 30 years now. So it's not nothing, and it could have some kind of leverage moving forward when geopolitical relations get bad on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I mean, ESA for now appears to be going forward with the ExoMars launch on a Proton in September. If they had to change that, they not only need a new launch vehicle, they probably also need a new landing platform, because Russia is providing the landing platform that their rover is going to go to the surface on Mars on. So that creates a bigger impact. Beyond that, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of major new initiatives with Russia in civil space, either by NASA or ESA or other Western space agencies. The ISS will continue. ExoMars will likely continue, but I don't expect to see any sort of major new ones come up. And obviously there are benefits to international cooperation in that respect, and in that respect, that losing that is unfortunate, but it's not surprising given the drift that we were already seeing between Russia and the West in civil space cooperation.
That's my assessment as well. I'm not going to comment more on that.
Okay, well, thank you for your comments. I'll just end. So I'd like to get kind of a 90-second to 2-minute wrap up from each of you of what next steps we can see. I'll pepper into that just thoughts on the Artemis 1 launch in the coming months and that program in the next few years, and the impact of SpaceX and other large-scale rockets, Starship, Starliner, and things like this. Obviously, we're looking at a potential paradigm shift in terms of at least U.S. and Western access to space going forward. So maybe with that in mind, closing thoughts, hopes for the future trajectory of space diplomacy, and we'll go Ramin, Jeff, and give the last word to Loren.
Well, thank you. I think one thing that is worth keeping in mind is that with space, there's always been a number of kinds of tensions. We've for a long time thought of it as a way of international cooperation, and it is. And it's fascinating how while some conflicts do extend into space, sometimes there's more cooperation in space than on the ground. But at the same time, there's always countries trying to advance their own interests, trying to advance their capabilities, and they want to show that they're the first to do something. And so there's that goes back to the original space race. And so there's always been that tension. And there's always been the tension between the military interests and scientific goals. And those tensions both of those tensions will continue into the future. And then added to the mix, we have the commercial space industry, which has grown rapidly. Personally, I'd like to see something more along the lines of international coalitions developing rules for space, and not just while some corporations are taking actions on their own, I would love to see coalitions of different governmental officials move things forward, perhaps with like along the lines of the Artemis Accords. So going back to your comment, I do think the next step that we will have to pay close attention to is the moon. There's going to be a lot of action on the moon, both with private companies and with the Artemis missions, and with China and other countries. And so now is the time. Instead of doing a launch first, ask questions later strategy that has happened to be that been the de facto situation before, I'd love to see more norms or some kind of rules emerge, maybe building on the Artemis Accords, but before we have a lot of rovers and landers and eventually astronauts on the moon. So that's the thing to pay attention to this year and the next few years.
Yeah, yeah. I don't want to leave people with the sort of a doom and gloom impression about what's going on in space. I think this is actually one of the most exciting times in space in decades right now. We're within a few months of the first launch of the Space Launch System, sending Orion around the moon. We've got Starship down in South Texas getting ready for a first orbital launch sometime probably in the next few months or so, depending on how that development program goes. There's sort of an unprecedented level of private investment going on in space right now. All sorts of new startups coming up, developing new launch vehicles, new spacecraft, trying to open up new markets. We're seeing, the emergence now of things like commercial space stations, space manufacturing, things that were, for a long time science fiction or something not really taken seriously, are now seeing billions of dollars put into that. So I think this is very important. Policy can be enabling for a lot of that. But these new ventures can also create challenges, some sort of policy challenges in terms of developing new regulations. What we're seeing with the mega constellations, I think, being a big example of that. So, policy has to play a big part in this future in space. But I think there's tremendous opportunity here, and whether or not we see greater international cooperation or not, we're going to see greater international activity in space, whether it's low Earth orbit or beyond, as more countries, more companies get involved. I think, again, this is a very interesting time. It's a great time to be covering the space industry as a reporter, because there's just so much going on. So I want to leave people in sort of an upbeat note that, there's a lot of potential out there. But again, policy is going to play a role in terms of what it can enable and how it solves some of the challenges that these new ventures, these new opportunities create.
I'll also say that, yes, it is a great time to be a space reporter. I'd also say it's a stressful time to be a space reporter, because we have to be just as nimble as these companies have learned to be as well. I think Ramin and Jeff summed everything up really well. I think maybe I'll take a more existential look. We didn't really talk about, how the public interacts with space, and that has gotten a lot of attention, especially over the last year with billionaires launching to space, a lot of opinions with, SpaceX just kind of launching what it wants without regard, or not without regard, but, in spite of a lot of criticisms from people and astronomers on the ground. And so I think we need to really often examine, why do we do what we do? And I think space diplomacy and international relations is just a very big component of that answer. Going to space is often about, how we can cooperate with our, our people and friends all over the world in other nations. And it can really be a great tool, like I said, when it comes to the International Space Station, of bringing people together. And especially as we embark on these bigger initiatives like Starship, like Artemis, all of these lunar initiatives that we have proposed through all these commercial companies, that just provides more opportunities for more people to get involved. And I think that should be taken into consideration when there is criticism on why we go to space and what we do. It really does bring people together to solve complex problems in ways that we never thought of before. And I think it's a great, powerful tool for international diplomacy in tough times such as these.
Well, thank you, Loren. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Ramin. Inspiring words. And I'll just say, there is a reason I had you three on. I'm big fans of your writing, each of you. And it is a really exciting time for space journalism. Obviously, this is a multifaceted issue set, from national security to geoeconomics to geopolitical issues to space technology to science advances. And obviously, this is something we're going to keep talking about. So to close things out, thank you, Loren Grush, science reporter at The Verge, Jeff Foust, senior staff writer for SpaceNews, and Ramin Skibba, covering space travel for Wired magazine. This is the first of many events in the Space Diplomacy Lab series here at the Duke Center for Duke Center for International and Global Studies. We'll continue to convene a diverse, multidisciplinary set of policymakers, academics, media, commercial spaceflight leaders, students, and diplomatic practitioners from the fields of space science and technology, national security, and international diplomacy to continue developing cross-cutting policy proposals and solutions to mitigate risks and ensure the promise of a secure and sustainable future in space. And I'll just say, as we close out each of these events, keep looking up.